The Montana Territory in 1887 was a place where broken men went to disappear, and Jonas McCready had been disappearing for 3 long years. Hidden deep in the pine forests of the Bitterroot Mountains, his cabin sat like a wound in the wilderness, silent, cold, and haunted by the ghosts of dreams that died too young. Jonas had once been a man who'd built cradles instead of coffins, who'd planted gardens instead of graves, who'd believed that love could conquer the cruelest tricks of fate. But that man had died on a snowy February night in 1884, buried alongside his wife Margaret and the daughter who'd never drawn her first breath. Now Jonas McCready was just the woodsman, a shadow who cut timber, trapped game, and spoke to no one except the wind that whispered through the pines. The townspeople of Cedar Falls knew him only as the silent figure who appeared every few months to trade furs for supplies, his eyes holding the kind of emptiness that warned decent folks to keep their distance. But even the most broken men can't outrun destiny forever. You're about to witness how $3 and 3 orphan children would shatter the careful walls Jonas had built around his grief. How a chance encounter at an orphan auction would force a man who'd given up on life to discover that sometimes the family you need most comes in the most unexpected packages. This is the story of Jonas McCready, who thought he was buying temporary help for his failing homestead. Of Lucy, Emma, and Sarah, 3 sisters whose own tragedy would collide with his in ways that would challenge everything he believed about loss, love, and the possibility of second chances. What Jonas didn't know was that one of these children carried a secret that would bring his dead daughter's memory rushing back with devastating clarity. He didn't know that his wife's dying words had somehow survived in the innocent voice of a 4-year-old girl who'd never known her name. The orphan office in Cedar Falls was about to close its doors forever, selling its remaining children like livestock to anyone with $3 and a pulse. Jonas McCready was about to discover that some purchases change everything, and that the most broken families are sometimes the ones most desperate to heal each other's wounds. Because when a grieving widower meets 3 orphan sisters, somebody's definition of family is about to expand beyond the boundaries of blood and birth. Someone's going to learn that the love you thought you'd lost forever might be exactly the love you need to save 3 innocent lives. In the summer of 1887, in a forgotten corner of Montana Territory, a woodsman who'd sworn never to love again was about to discover that the human heart has a capacity for healing that no amount of grief can destroy. The auction block was waiting. The children needed homes. And Jonas McCready was about to learn that sometimes the most important investments are the ones that seem impossible to afford. Sometimes $3 can buy you everything you never knew you needed. Sometimes the family you're meant to have finds you when you've stopped looking for them entirely. Jonas McCready hadn't set foot in Cedar Falls for 6 months, and he could already feel why he'd stayed away. The town pressed against him like a too small coat, all noise and movement, and people who remembered when he'd been someone different. Someone who'd smiled and made plans and believed the future held more than just surviving until tomorrow. He'd only come for supplies, salt, ammunition, and the wool socks that kept his feet from freezing during the long Montana winters. What he hadn't expected was the crowd gathered around the orphan office, and he sure as hell hadn't expected the wooden sign that made his stomach clench with unwanted memories. Final liquidation, all remaining children, $3 each. Children, being sold like cattle or grain sacks. Jonas tried to walk past, focusing on the trading post across the street, but something stopped him. Maybe it was the way the crowd murmured with the casual cruelty of people discussing livestock prices. Maybe it was the memory of his own childhood, shuffled between reluctant relatives after his parents died. Or maybe it was just the stubborn streak that had kept him alive when grief tried to kill him. He found himself pushing through the crowd toward the makeshift platform where Reverend Patterson stood with a ledger and a cash box, looking like a man selling his soul 1 coin at a time. Folks, Patterson called out, his voice carrying the false cheer of a snake oil salesman. We've got 3 fine children left, and the county's given us until sundown to find them homes. Otherwise, it's the workhouse in Helena, and we all know what that means. Jonas knew what it meant. He'd seen the children who came back from Helena's workhouse, the ones who came back at all. Hollow-eyed, bent-backed, with spirits crushed so thoroughly they could barely remember their own names. On the platform stood 3 girls, and the sight of them hit Jonas like a fist to the chest. They couldn't have been more than 8, 6, and 4 years old, dressed in identical gray orphanage uniforms that hung loose on their thin frames. But it wasn't their poverty that stopped his breath. It was the way they stood. The oldest girl had her arms wrapped protectively around her younger sisters, her chin raised with a defiance that reminded Jonas painfully of Margaret when she'd been cornered by life's cruelties. The middle child kept glancing at the crowd with curious, intelligent eyes that seemed too knowing for her age. And the youngest looked directly at Jonas with eyes the exact shade of blue as his daughter's had been in the dreams that still haunted his sleep. "The McAllister girls," Patterson was saying, consulting his ledger. "Ages 8, 6, and 4. Lucy's good with sewing and cooking. Emma can read and write better than most adults. And little Sarah, well, she's quiet, but she'll grow into usefulness. Together or separate, $3 each." "What about their parents?" as someone called out. "Fever took the whole family except these 3. Been with us 8 months now. Good children, no real behavioral problems, though the youngest sometimes talks to herself. Nothing discipline won't cure." Jonas watched Sarah lean closer to Lucy, whispering something that made the older girl nod and whisper back. Sisters protecting each other the way Margaret would have protected their daughter if she'd lived long enough to need protecting. "Do I hear $3 for the oldest?" Patterson continued. "She's nearly ready for domestic service. Could earn her keep in any household. I'll take her." The voice belonged to Ezra Hutchins, who owned the largest ranch in the valley and had a reputation for working his help harder than his horses. "Good strong back on that one." Jonas felt his jaw clench. Lucy couldn't have been more than 8 years old, and Hutchins was talking about her like a draft animal. $3 for Lucy McAllister. Anyone else?" "I'll bid on the middle one," called out Mrs. Pemberton, the banker's wife. "She'd make a fine serving girl once she's trained proper." $3. Jonas watched Emma's face crumple slightly before she straightened her shoulders and lifted her chin. 6 years old and already learning that her value was measured in how well she could serve people who saw her as property. "And the little one?" Patterson looked around the crowd. "Anyone interested in Sarah McAllister?" Silence. The kind of heavy, uncomfortable silence that settled over crowds when they were witnessing something shameful but profitable. "She's awful young," someone muttered. "More trouble than she's worth." "Give her a year or 2, Patterson said desperately. "She'll grow into—" "I'll take all 3. The words left Jonas's mouth before his brain could stop them. The crowd turned to stare at the tall, bearded woodsman who'd appeared at the back, like a ghost stepping out of the forest. "Excuse me?" Patterson blinked in surprise. "All 3 girls. I'll take them." Jonas stepped forward, ignoring the whispers that followed him. $9 total. Ezra Hutchins scowled. "Now hold on, McCready. I already bid on the oldest. You bid $3. I'm bidding 9 for all of them." Jonas met Hutchins' glare without flinching. "Unless you want to raise your bid to cover all 3 sisters?" Hutchins looked at the 3 girls, calculating profit against expense, then shook his head. "Ain't worth it. 1 child's plenty." "Anyone else?" Patterson asked, though his relief was obvious. Selling all 3 children at once meant his problem would be completely solved. Going once, going twice. Sold to Jonas McCready for $9. As Jonas counted out the money, nearly half his available cash, he wondered what the hell he'd just done. He lived alone in a 1-room cabin, barely spoke to another human being from 1 month to the next, and knew less about caring for children than he did about flying to the moon. But when he looked up at the platform and saw Lucy's suspicious relief, Emma's cautious hope, and Sarah's steady blue gaze, he knew he couldn't have done anything else. "You'll need to sign papers," Patterson said, shuffling through his documents. "Takes legal responsibility, of course. Any health problems, behavioral issues, that's all on you now." "Fine." Jonas scrawled his name on the papers without reading them. "They got belongings?" "What you see is what they've got. The dresses they're wearing and a small bag of personal items." Jonas looked at the 3 girls. His girls, he supposed, though the thought made his chest tight with panic. "Come on then, let's go home." Lucy came down from the platform first, still keeping herself between her sisters and the world. Emma followed, clutching a small cloth bag that probably contained everything they owned. Sarah came last, and as she passed Jonas, she looked up at him with those unsettling blue eyes and whispered something so softly he almost missed it. "Thank you, Mr. Jonas." He stopped dead, his heart hammering against his ribs. Not Mr. or Sir or even Macready. She called him Mr. Jonas, the same way his daughter would have if she lived long enough to learn his name. "How do you know?" Jonas started to ask, then shook his head. It was just coincidence. Children picked up names from overheard conversations. There was nothing mysterious about it. But as they walked through Cedar Falls toward where he'd left his wagon, Sarah slipped her small hand into his rough one with the confidence of a child who'd never learned to fear strangers. And for just a moment, Jonas could almost imagine he felt Margaret's approval in the mountain wind that whispered through the pines. He'd bought 3 orphans for $9 and didn't have the first idea what to do with them. But as they climbed into his wagon and started the long journey back to his cabin, Jonas realized something had shifted in the careful emptiness he'd built around his life. For the first time in 3 years, he wasn't going home alone. And somehow that felt like the most terrifying and wonderful thing that had happened to him since the night his world had ended in blood and snow. The girls sat quietly in the wagon bed as they left Cedar Falls behind, but Jonas could feel their eyes on him, measuring, evaluating, hoping. Lucy watched the road ahead with the wariness of someone who'd learned not to trust adults who made promises. Emma studied the passing landscape with intelligent curiosity, as if memorizing landmarks in case she needed to find her way back. And Sarah looked at Jonas like she'd been waiting her whole life for him to find her, which was impossible, of course. But as they rolled deeper into the wilderness toward his isolated cabin, Jonas couldn't shake the feeling that this chance encounter had been anything but chance, that maybe somehow Margaret had been guiding his steps all along. The wagon bounced along the narrow mountain trail as afternoon shadows grew longer, and Jonas found himself stealing glances at his unexpected passengers. The 3 girls sat quietly in the wagon bed, Lucy keeping her sisters close, while Emma pointed out birds and wildflowers in whispered excitement. Sarah simply watched the forest with those unsettling blue eyes, as if she recognized something in the wilderness that the others couldn't see. "How much farther, Mr. Jonas?" Emma asked, the first words any of them had spoken since leaving Cedar Falls. "Another hour, maybe less." Jonas cleared his throat, unused to conversation. "Trail gets rough ahead, so hold on tight." "We will," Lucy said firmly, her protective instincts clearly extending to managing her sister's behavior around their new guardian. As they climbed higher into the mountains, Jonas's anxiety grew. His cabin had been built for one man who barely wanted to exist, let alone live. There was one room, one bed, and supplies for one person who ate when he remembered and slept when exhaustion forced him to. What was he supposed to do with 3 children who would need meals and baths and, God help him, bedtime stories? "Mr. Jonas?" Sarah's voice was so soft he almost missed it over the wagon wheels. "Are you scared too?" The question hit him like a physical blow. He turned to look at the 4-year-old who'd somehow identified the emotion he'd been trying to hide from himself. "Maybe a little," he admitted, surprised by his own honesty. Sarah nodded seriously. "It's okay to be scared. Lucy says being scared just means something important is happening." "Out of the mouths of babes." Jonas glanced at Lucy, seeing wisdom in her 8-year-old face that most adults never achieved. These children had survived losses that would have broken grown men, and somehow they'd emerged with their capacity for hope intact. The cabin came into view just as the sun touched the western peaks, casting long shadows across the small clearing Jonas had carved from the wilderness. It looked exactly what it was, a refuge for a man who'd given up on civilization. The logs were weathered gray, the single window was small and high, and the front porch sagged under the weight of 3 years' worth of neglect. "This is home," Jonas said, trying to see his sanctuary through children's eyes. "It's not much, but it's warm and dry." Emma's face lit up. "It's perfect. Look, Lucy, it's like the cabin in the fairy tale book." Lucy's expression was more reserved. She'd clearly learned not to trust in perfect endings. "Where will we sleep?" That was the question Jonas had been dreading. "Well, there's only one bed, but I can make pallets on the floor. Or I could sleep outside until I build something more permanent." We can share, Lucy said quickly. We're used to it. Emma kicks, but Sarah's quiet. I do not kick, Emma protested, then looked guilty. Well, maybe a little. The domesticity of their banter made Jonas's chest tight with memories of conversations he'd never had with his own daughter. He helped them down from the wagon, noting how Lucy immediately began organizing their few possessions, while Emma explored the clearing with boundless curiosity. Sarah, however, walked straight to the cabin door and placed her small hand on the wood as if she were greeting an old friend. She missed you, Sarah said softly. Jonas froze. What did you say? Sarah looked up at him with those impossible blue eyes. The house. She missed you while you were gone. Houses get lonely too. It was exactly the kind of whimsical thing a 4-year-old might say, but something in her tone made Jonas's skin prickle with recognition. Margaret used to talk to their house the same way, greeting it when they returned from town, apologizing when they left it empty too long. How do you know about? Jonas started to ask, then caught himself. He was reading too much into innocent words spoken by a child who'd been through trauma. Never mind, let's get you settled inside. The cabin's interior was even less welcoming than the exterior. One room dominated by a stone fireplace, with Jonas's narrow bed pushed against the far wall, a rough wooden table, 2 chairs, and shelves lined with basic supplies. It smelled of wood smoke, leather, and the kind of solitude that had weight and substance. Oh, Emma breathed, and Jonas braced himself for disappointment. Instead, she clapped her hands in delight. It's like a fairy tale cottage. Lucy, look at the fireplace. And there's books. She'd spotted the small collection of volumes on Jonas's shelf, mostly practical guides to farming and hunting, but including the Bible and poetry collection that had been Margaret's. Books he hadn't touched in 3 years, but couldn't bring himself to burn. Can we really stay here? Emma asked, her enthusiasm infectious despite Jonas's growing panic. For now, he said carefully, we'll see how it goes. Lucy began unpacking their small bag with practiced efficiency, revealing a worn doll, a few pieces of clothing, and a small wooden box that she handled with particular care. What's in there? Jonas asked gently. Lucy hesitated, then opened the box to reveal a few letters, a pressed flower, and a small silver locket. Things that belong to Mom and Papa. It's all we have left of them. The simple statement broke Jonas's heart. These children had lost everything, just as he had, but they'd somehow managed to preserve hope where he'd found only bitterness. We'll keep them safe, he promised, and meant it. As evening settled over the mountains, Jonas found himself completely out of his depth. The girls were hungry, but his usual meal of jerky and hardtack wasn't suitable for children. He had no idea what time they should go to bed, or whether they needed baths, or how to handle the 1,000 small requirements of caring for young lives. Lucy, sensing his distress, stepped into the breach with the competence of someone far older than her years. Emma, help me see what supplies Mr. Jonas has. Sarah, you can gather kindling for the fire. Just small pieces like I showed you. You don't have to, Jonas started. We want to help, Lucy said firmly. We earn our keep. That's what they taught us at the orphanage. The matter-of-fact way she said it made Jonas angry at adults who taught children that their worth was measured in usefulness. This isn't the orphanage. You don't have to earn anything here. Lucy looked at him with surprise, as if the concept of unconditional care was foreign to her. Then what do you want from us? The question was so direct, so adult, that Jonas found himself struggling for an answer. What did he want from them? He'd bought them on impulse, driven by emotions he didn't understand. Now that they were here, in his space, disrupting his carefully constructed solitude, what came next? I want you to be safe, he said finally. And happy, if that's possible. Everything else we'll figure out as we go. Lucy studied his face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Okay, but we still want to help. It feels better when we're useful. As they worked together to prepare a simple meal of beans and cornbread, Jonas found himself observing the girls' dynamic. Lucy was clearly the leader, making decisions and managing her sisters with gentle authority. Emma was the explorer, chattering about everything she saw and asking endless questions about life in the wilderness. And Sarah was the mystery. She moved through the cabin like she'd been there before, knowing instinctively where things belonged, anticipating Jonas's needs before he voiced them. When he reached for the coffee pot, she was already pointing to where he'd stored it. When he looked for his spare blankets, she nodded toward the chest in the corner. "Sarah, how did you know where the blankets were?" Jonas asked as they prepared sleeping arrangements. Sarah tilted her head, considering the question seriously. "The lady with yellow hair told me. She likes to keep things neat." Jonas's blood turned to ice. "What lady?" "The one who lives here sometimes. She has yellow hair like sunshine, and she smells like flowers. She's sad, but she's happy you brought us home." Lucy frowned at her youngest sister. "Sarah, there's no lady here. Don't make up stories." But Jonas couldn't breathe. Margaret had golden hair that caught sunlight like spun silk. Margaret had always smelled of the wildflowers she loved to gather. Margaret had lived in this cabin for the 2 years before she died, and if her spirit lingered anywhere, it would be here. "What else did the lady tell you?" Jonas asked, his voice barely steady. Sarah looked up at him with those knowing blue eyes. "She said you forgot how to smile, but we can help you remember. And she said to tell you that baby Rose is safe now. She's waiting for you both to come home when it's time." The room spun around Jonas. Rose. They'd named their daughter Rose, planning to call her Rosie when she got older. It was a name he'd never spoken aloud since the night she died, a secret he'd carried like a stone in his chest for 3 years. There was no way Sarah could know that name. No way she could know about Margaret's appearance or her love of flowers. No possible explanation except, "Sarah," Lucy said sharply, clearly frightened by Jonas's reaction. "Stop talking nonsense. You're scaring Mr. Jonas." But Sarah just smiled with the serene confidence of a child who saw no difference between the living and the dead. "The lady says not to be scared. She says love doesn't end just because bodies do, and she's glad we're here to take care of you." Jonas staggered outside onto the porch, his heart hammering against his ribs. The mountain air was cold and clean, but it couldn't wash away the impossible truth of what he'd just heard. Emma appeared beside him, her young face creased with worry. "Are you okay, Mr. Jonas?" "Sarah doesn't mean to be strange. She just sees things sometimes." "What kind of things?" Emma shrugged. "People who aren't there anymore. She talked to our mama for weeks after she died. The orphanage people said it was just grief, but Sarah knew things. Private things Mama never told anyone else." Jonas looked through the window at Sarah, who was helping Lucy arrange blankets on the floor with the matter-of-fact competence of someone much older, a 4-year-old girl who claimed to speak with his dead wife and knew the name of his daughter who'd lived less than an hour. Either he'd lost his mind or he'd somehow bought 3 orphans who came with a direct connection to the family he'd lost. As night settled over the cabin and the girls curled up together near the fire, Jonas sat in his chair and watched them sleep. Lucy's arm protectively around Emma, Emma's hand resting on Sarah's shoulder, Sarah's face peaceful with the innocence of childhood. He'd thought he was saving them from the workhouse, but as Sarah's words echoed in his mind, words that could only have come from Margaret herself, Jonas began to wonder if maybe they'd been sent to save him. "Thank you," he whispered to the darkness, not sure if he was addressing the living or the dead. From her place by the fire, Sarah stirred in her sleep and smiled, and just for a moment, Jonas could have sworn he smelled wildflowers on the mountain wind. Jonas woke before dawn to the sound of quiet voices and the smell of coffee brewing. For a moment he lay still, convinced he was dreaming. Then reality crashed back. 3 orphan girls were living in his cabin, and one of them apparently spoke to his dead wife. He found Lucy at the stove, carefully tending a pot of porridge while Emma set wooden bowls on the table. Sarah sat in the corner, having what appeared to be a one-sided conversation with empty air. "She says you like your coffee black," Sarah announced without looking up, "and that you used to sing while you worked, before you got too sad to remember the songs." Jonas's hand froze halfway to the coffee pot. Margaret had always teased him about his off-key humming while he chopped wood or mended tools. It was such a specific private memory that no child could have guessed it. "Sarah," Lucy said firmly, "eat your breakfast and stop talking to invisible people." She's not invisible, Sarah replied matter-of-factly. She's just different now. Like how water becomes steam, but it's still water. Emma looked up from her bowl with curiosity rather than fear. What does she look like? Pretty. She has kind eyes and she misses Mr. Jonas very much. She says she's been waiting for us to come take care of him because he forgot how to take care of himself. Jonas set down his coffee cup with shaking hands. Sarah, what's the lady's name? Margaret, Sarah said simply, and she wants to show you something outside. She says it's important. The cabin fell silent except for the crackle of the fire. Lucy and Emma stared at their youngest sister, while Jonas felt the world tilt beneath his feet. He'd never told them Margaret's name. Mr. Jonas! Emma's voice was small. Are you okay? I need some air, Jonas managed, pushing back from the table. Outside, the morning mist clung to the mountains like ghostly fingers. Jonas walked to the edge of his clearing, trying to process what was happening. Either Sarah was somehow channeling his dead wife, or grief had finally driven him completely insane. The garden, Sarah's voice came from behind him. She wants you to remember the garden. Jonas turned to find all three girls had followed him outside. Sarah was pointing to a patch of earth behind the cabin that had been overgrown with weeds for 3 years. Margaret planted flowers there, Jonas said quietly, before she died. She says they're still there, under all the weeds, sleeping, waiting for someone to wake them up. Sarah walked over to the forgotten plot and knelt down. She says baby Rose would have loved to help with the flowers. Jonas's legs nearly gave out. He sank onto a fallen log, overwhelmed by memories he'd spent 3 years trying to bury. Emma, with the intuitive kindness of childhood, came to sit beside him. Sarah sees things that make grown-ups scared sometimes, but she's never mean about it. She just wants to help. What happened to your mama and papa? Jonas asked, needing to understand these children who'd arrived in his life like a miracle wrapped in tragedy. Lucy answered, her voice steady despite the pain in her eyes. Fever. It took everyone in our town except us. We were sick too, but we got better. Mama died holding baby Rose. She stopped, her face paling. I mean, holding our baby brother. His name was Thomas. But Sarah shook her head. No, Lucy. Mama said this baby Rose, not our Thomas. She said Mr. Jonas needs to know that baby Rose is happy and safe, and she's not alone. Jonas buried his face in his hands. Rose. His daughter had lived exactly 47 minutes, just long enough for him to hold her tiny, perfect body and whisper her name. Margaret had died from complications hours later, taking with her all the joy and hope Jonas had ever known. But Rose had been buried in his arms, and he'd never told another living soul her name. How? He whispered. How could you possibly know that? Sarah came over and put her small hand on his knee. Because love is stronger than dying, Mr. Jonas. And because baby Rose wanted me to tell you she's not sad anymore. She's with Mama Margaret, and they're both watching over you. For the first time in 3 years, Jonas wept. Not the bitter, angry tears he'd shed alone in his cabin, but the cleansing tears of a man finally allowing himself to grieve properly. Lucy and Emma moved closer, their own eyes wet with sympathetic tears, while Sarah simply held his hand and waited. She says you can plant the garden again, Sarah said softly. Not to replace what was lost, but to grow something new. She says gardens are about hope, and hope is what keeps love alive. Jonas looked at the 3 girls who'd somehow become his responsibility, then at the forgotten plot where Margaret's dreams had once bloomed. Maybe Sarah was truly speaking to the dead, or maybe she was just a traumatized child with an extraordinary gift for reading grief. It didn't matter. What mattered was that for the first time since his world ended, Jonas felt something other than emptiness. Would you like to help me clear the garden? He asked. Emma's face lit up. Really? We can plant flowers. We can plant whatever you want, Jonas said, surprised by the steady sound of his own voice. Flowers, vegetables, herbs for cooking, whatever makes you happy. As they spent the morning pulling weeds and clearing the forgotten plot, Jonas found himself humming, actually humming, for the first time in years. The girls worked with the enthusiasm of children given purpose, and gradually the earth that had been buried under neglect began to emerge. "Look," Emma cried, pointing to a corner of the garden. "There's something growing here already." Jonas knelt beside her and gently brushed away the weeds. Underneath, impossibly, a small rose bush had survived 3 years of neglect. Its leaves were pale and its stems weak, but it was alive. A single bud clung to the highest branch, preparing to bloom despite everything. Sarah smiled with satisfaction. "She told you there were still flowers waiting? They just needed someone to remember they were there." That evening, as the girls helped him prepare dinner, Jonas found himself studying their faces in the firelight. Lucy's quiet strength, Emma's irrepressible curiosity, Sarah's mysterious wisdom. Somehow they'd filled spaces in his life he hadn't even realized were empty. "Mr. Jonas," Lucy asked quietly, "are you sorry you bought us?" Jonas set down his spoon and looked at her seriously. "Lucy, I want you to listen carefully. You are not something I bought. You are three remarkable young ladies who needed a home, and I needed you even though I didn't know it. There's a difference." "What difference?" Emma asked. "Things you buy are just objects. Family is something you choose to love, and something that chooses to love you back." Sarah nodded approvingly. "She says that's exactly right. She says families aren't about blood. They're about hearts that decide to stay together." As Jonas tucked the girls into their makeshift beds that night, he realized his cabin no longer felt like a tomb. It felt like what it had always been meant to be, a home where love could grow, even in the most unlikely circumstances. And when Sarah whispered, "Good night, Mama Margaret," to the empty air before closing her eyes, Jonas found himself whispering his own good night to the wife who'd somehow found a way to bring him back to life. 2 weeks passed in a rhythm Jonas had never expected to find again. The girls fit into his life like pieces of a puzzle he hadn't known was incomplete. Lucy managed the household with quiet efficiency. Emma filled the cabin with laughter and endless questions. And Sarah continued her mysterious conversations with someone only she could see. Jonas found himself changing in small ways. He shaved more regularly because Emma said his beard was scratchy for hugs. He started cooking proper meals because Lucy worried about nutrition. He even began telling stories by the fire because Sarah asked about his childhood with Margaret. But it was Sarah's otherworldly knowledge that continued to shake him to his core. That morning, as Jonas returned from checking his trap lines, he found the girls in the garden they'd been restoring together. Emma was planting seeds with enthusiastic imprecision. Lucy was carefully weeding around the surviving rose bush, and Sarah was sitting perfectly still having another of her one-sided conversations. "She's excited about something," Sarah announced as Jonas approached. "She says today is special because you're finally ready to hear the whole truth." Jonas set down his catch and knelt beside Sarah. Over the past 2 weeks, he'd stopped questioning these moments and started listening. Whether Sarah was truly speaking to Margaret's spirit or simply processing trauma through remarkable intuition, her words consistently brought him comfort and understanding. "What truth?" Jonas asked gently. Sarah tilted her head, listening to something only she could hear. "She says you need to understand why we came to you. It wasn't accident, Mr. Jonas. It was, what's the word? Destiny." Lucy looked up from her weeding, frowning. "Sarah, stop making up stories." "I'm not making up," Sarah protested. "Tell them, Mama Margaret. Tell them about the night baby Rose was born." Jonas felt his heart stop. "Sarah, what about that night?" "She was there when baby Rose died. She held her while you held both of them, and baby Rose whispered something before she stopped breathing. Something important." Jonas's hands began to shake. That night was the worst memory of his life, too painful to examine even in his dreams. "Sarah, I don't think—" "Baby Rose whispered a name," Sarah continued, her young voice carrying impossible authority. "She whispered Sarah, because she knew that someday a little girl named Sarah would come to take care of you when Mama Margaret couldn't anymore." The world went silent around Jonas. He remembered that night with crystal clarity, holding his dying daughter while Margaret slipped away from blood loss, whispering desperate prayers to a God who seemed to have abandoned them. But Rose, had she made a sound just before the end? Had there been a whisper so soft he'd convinced himself it was just air leaving tiny lungs? "That's impossible," Lucy said. but her voice wavered with uncertainty. Emma had stopped planting and was staring at her youngest sister with wide eyes. Sarah, how could you know about a baby who died before you were born? Sarah smiled with the patient expression of someone explaining something obvious to slow adults. Because Baby Rose told me. She came to me in dreams after our mama and papa died. She said I had to take care of Mr. Jonas because he was her papa, and he was too sad to remember how to live. Jonas felt the earth shift beneath him. Sarah, when did these dreams start? Right after the fever took our family. I was sick and almost died too, but Baby Rose came and told me I had to get better. She said she couldn't stay with her papa, but I could. She said it was my job now. That's why you always seem to know things about the cabin, Jonas whispered, understanding flooding through him. About where things belonged, about Margaret's habits. Sarah nodded. Baby Rose remembered everything from when she was inside Mama Margaret's tummy. She remembered the cabin and the garden and how much you loved each other. She wanted me to help you remember too. Lucy sat back on her heels, her practical mind struggling with impossible concepts. But Sarah, that would mean my daughter's spirit guided you to me, Jonas finished, tears streaming down his face. That somehow, even in death, Rose found a way to send me exactly what I needed most. Emma's voice was small with wonder. So we're like replacement children? No, Jonas said firmly, pulling all three girls into his arms. You could never replace Rose, just like you could never replace your own parents. But sometimes the people we love find ways to keep loving us even after they're gone. Sometimes they send us exactly the family we need to heal. Sarah leaned against his chest, satisfied that her message had finally been understood. Mama Margaret says you don't have to be sad anymore. Baby Rose is happy because she found a way to give you daughters who could grow up and love you back. As Jonas held the three girls who'd somehow become his world, he understood that his impulse to buy them at the orphan auction hadn't been impulse at all. It had been love reaching across the veil of death, guiding him toward the family he was meant to have. Does this mean we can stay forever? Emma asked hopefully. Jonas looked around at the garden they'd restored together, the cabin that had become a home again, the faces of three children who'd arrived as strangers and become his heart. If you want to stay, you'll always have a place here, not as orphans I bought, but as daughters I choose to love. Even though we're not really your daughters? Lucy asked, still struggling with the enormity of what they'd learned. Jonas met her eyes with absolute certainty. Lucy, the moment I held Sarah's hand at that auction, you became my daughters in every way that matters. Blood doesn't make a family, love does. And I love all three of you more than I ever thought possible. That evening, as they sat around the fire, Sarah made one final announcement from her invisible advisor. Mama Margaret says to tell you she's proud of the man you've become. And Baby Rose says thank you for giving her sisters she always wanted. Sarah paused, tilting her head. And they both say they'll always be watching over our family, but they don't need to visit anymore. Because you remember how to be happy now. As if to prove the point, the rose bush they'd rescued bloomed that very night. 3 perfect roses, as if the garden itself was celebrating the completion of their unlikely family. Jonas McCready had thought he was buying 3 orphans for $9. Instead, he'd been given 3 daughters by the ghost of the child he'd lost, a little girl who'd loved him so much that even death couldn't stop her from making sure he wasn't alone. Sometimes the most impossible love stories were the ones that began with endings, and found their happy endings in new beginnings that seemed too miraculous to believe. But as Jonas tucked his 3 daughters into bed that night, listening to their sleepy goodnights and contented sighs, he knew that miracles were just love finding creative ways to continue existing in a world that tried to convince people love could die. His family was proof that love, once given, never truly ended. It just transformed into new shapes and found new ways to bloom. Summer arrived in the Montana mountains with the gentle insistence of hope returning to a grieving heart. Jonas woke each morning to the sounds of his daughters, he'd finally allowed himself to think, chattering over breakfast and planning their day's adventures. The cabin that had once echoed with lonely silence now rang with laughter, arguments, and the constant hum of family life. Papa Jonas, can we pick berries today? Emma asked over her porridge, bouncing in her chair with excitement. She'd started calling him Papa Jonas 3 weeks ago, and each time she said it, something tight in his chest loosened a little more. After chores, he replied, marveling at how naturally the word chores had entered his vocabulary. Before the girls, his days had been about mere survival. Now they were about teaching, nurturing, building something that would last. Lucy, ever practical, was already planning. We'll need baskets, and Sarah should wear her long sleeves so she doesn't get scratched. Sarah looked up from where she was carefully feeding bits of porridge to her cloth doll. The same doll she'd arrived with, now named Rose in honor of the sister she'd never met, but somehow knew. Mama Margaret says the best berries are on the south slope, near the old lightning tree. Jonas no longer questioned Sarah's mysterious knowledge. Whether she truly spoke to spirits or simply possessed an uncanny intuition, her guidance had never led them wrong. The south slope did indeed have the best berries, and the old lightning tree was exactly where she'd said it would be. As they prepared for their berry-picking expedition, Jonas caught himself humming a lullaby Margaret used to sing. Emma immediately picked up the tune, her sweet voice harmonizing with his deeper tones. Lucy joined in shyly, and even Sarah added her baby-soft soprano to their impromptu choir. "We sound like a real family," Emma declared with satisfaction. "We are a real family," Jonas corrected gently. "The realest family in all of Montana territory." The berry-picking expedition became a lesson in patience, teamwork, and the fine art of eating more berries than you picked. Jonas watched his daughters work together, Lucy organizing their efforts, Emma exploring every bush with scientific curiosity, Sarah quietly accumulating the fullest basket while having whispered conversations with invisible advisors. "Papa Jonas," Lucy said during their lunch break, "what were you like when you were our age?" It was the first time she'd asked about his past, and Jonas realized she was finally comfortable enough to be curious about the man who'd become her father. "Stubborn," he admitted with a smile, "and lonely. I didn't have sisters like you three do." "Is that why you wanted us?" Emma asked with her characteristic directness. Jonas considered the question seriously. "I think I wanted you because you needed me, and I needed you, even though I didn't understand that at the time. Sometimes the best decisions are the ones we make before we're smart enough to talk ourselves out of them." Sarah looked up from her conversation with her doll. "She says you were meant to be our pop all along. She says some families just take longer to find each other." As they walked home with their berry harvest, Jonas felt a contentment he'd forgotten was possible. But that evening brought an unexpected challenge that would test their newfound family bonds. A knock at the door interrupted their berry pie dinner. Jonas opened it to find Reverend Patterson, the same man who'd auctioned the girls at the orphan office. "Mr. McCready," Patterson said, his voice carrying an official tone that made Jonas's stomach clench, "I need to speak with you about the children." Jonas stepped outside, closing the door behind him. "What about them?" "There's been a complaint. Some folks in town are saying it's not proper, a bachelor raising 3 young girls alone. There's talk of having them placed in more appropriate homes." Ice ran through Jonas's veins. "These girls are my daughters now. I have the papers." "Papers that say they're bound to you for labor, not adopted as family. There's a difference legally speaking." Patterson's expression was sympathetic but firm. "Judge Morrison wants to review the situation. There'll be a hearing next week." Through the window, Jonas could see his daughters watching anxiously. Lucy had moved protectively closer to her sisters, as if sensing trouble. "They belong here," Jonas said quietly. "This is their home." "I believe that, McCready. I've heard reports about how well you're caring for them. But appearances matter, and you'll need to prove to the judge that your arrangement is in their best interests." After Patterson left, Jonas sat his daughters down and explained the situation as gently as possible. Lucy went pale, Emma burst into tears, and Sarah simply nodded as if she'd been expecting this challenge. "Are they going to take us away?" Emma sobbed. "Not if I can help it," Jonas promised, pulling her into his arms. "We'll fight this together. We're a family, and families don't give up on each other." "What do we need to do?" Lucy asked, her 8-year-old voice carrying the weight of someone much older. "We need to show the judge that we belong together, that you're not just 3 children I'm caring for, but daughters I love with all my heart." Sarah spoke up quietly. She says not to worry. She says some battles are won before they're fought, and this is one of them. Jonas hoped Sarah's invisible advisor was right, but he spent the sleepless night making plans. If someone wanted to take his daughters away, they'd have to prove that he wasn't capable of loving and protecting them. And Jonas was prepared to move heaven and earth to show that these three girls had transformed him from a broken man into the father they deserved. The next morning, he began teaching them everything he knew about mountain living, not because they needed to earn their keep, but because he wanted the judge to see that they were thriving under his care. Lucy learned to bake bread that rose perfectly. Emma mastered the art of reading animal tracks. Sarah demonstrated her uncanny ability to predict weather patterns. But more importantly, Jonas began documenting their daily life. The way Lucy naturally took care of her sisters, how Emma's curiosity led to wonderful discoveries, how Sarah's quiet wisdom brought peace to their household. He wanted written proof that these weren't orphans being housed by a reluctant bachelor, but daughters being raised by a man who discovered his true purpose in loving them. As the hearing approached, Jonas realized he wasn't just fighting for custody of three children. He was fighting for the right to be the man Margaret and Rose had somehow conspired to help him become. A father whose love could heal the wounds left by loss, and whose family could prove that sometimes the most broken pieces fit together to create something stronger than anything that had come before. The battle for his daughters was about to begin, but Jonas McCready was no longer the hollow man who'd bought three orphans on impulse. He was a father, and fathers fought for their children with everything they had. Even when the odds seemed impossible, love found a way to win. The morning of the hearing dawned gray and cold, as if the Montana sky itself disapproved of what was about to happen. Jonas dressed his daughters in their best clothes, simple dresses he'd bought in town, but clean and carefully mended by Lucy's skilled hands. They looked like what they were, three loved children preparing to fight for their family. "Remember what we practiced," Jonas said as they climbed into the wagon. "Answer the judge's questions honestly, but don't be afraid to tell him how you feel about living here." Lucy nodded solemnly, her hand protectively holding Emma's. "We will, Papa Jonas. We'll make sure he understands." Emma, usually irrepressible, was unusually quiet. "What if he doesn't believe us? What if he thinks we're just being loyal because we're scared?" "Then we'll deal with that when it happens," Jonas replied. "But Emma, what you feel for me isn't loyalty born of fear. It's love born of choice, and that's something even judges can recognize." Sarah, sitting calmly with her doll, spoke up. "She says the judge has lost children too. She says his heart will remember what family really means." The courthouse in Cedar Falls was packed with townspeople who'd come to witness the spectacle. Jonas spotted faces both friendly and hostile. Mrs. Peterson, who'd bid on Emma at the auction, Ezra Hutchins, who still scowled at having lost his chance at cheap labor, and surprisingly, several families who nodded encouragingly at Jonas and his daughters. Judge Morrison was a stern man, with silver hair and eyes that seemed to weigh souls. He called the court to order and reviewed the case with methodical precision. "Mr. McCready, you purchased these children at a county liquidation sale for the purpose of household labor. Several citizens have raised concerns about the propriety of a bachelor raising three young girls without proper female supervision." Jonas stood, his hat in his hands. "Your Honor, I may have bought them, but I've raised them." "There's a difference. Explain that difference." Jonas looked at his daughters, drawing strength from their encouraging faces. "When I bought them, I thought I was saving them from the workhouse. I thought I needed help around my homestead. But within days, I realized they weren't helping me survive. They were teaching me how to live again." "That's very poetic, Mr. McCready, but this court deals in facts. What concrete evidence do you have that these children are better off with you than in proper homes with married couples?" Before Jonas could answer, Lucy stood up. "Your Honor, may I speak?" Judge Morrison raised an eyebrow. "You're rather young for legal proceedings, miss." "I'm old enough to know the difference between being wanted and being needed," Lucy replied with startling maturity. "Before we came to Papa Jonas, we were burdens. People fed us because they had to, housed us because the county paid them to. Papa Jonas feeds us because he loves watching us grow. He houses us because we make his house a home. Emma jumped up beside her sister. And he doesn't make us work like servants. He teaches us things because he wants us to be smart and strong and happy. He reads us stories and tucks us in and worries when we get sick. Judge Morrison's stern expression softened slightly. And you, young lady, he asked Sarah, what do you think about living with Mr. McCready? Sarah stood clutching her doll and spoke with the quiet certainty that had amazed Jonas from the beginning. Papa Jonas was broken when we found him. We were broken too. But broken things can be fixed when they have love to hold them together. He's not our papa because he bought us. He's our papa because he chose to love us, and we chose to love him back. This is highly irregular, someone called from the gallery. Jonas recognized Hutchins' voice. A bachelor raising 3 girls is improper, regardless of sentiment. Judge Morrison banged his gavel for order, then looked thoughtfully at Jonas. Mr. McCready, how do you respond to concerns about propriety? Jonas took a deep breath. Your Honor, I can't give these girls a mother, but I can give them a father who would die before letting harm come to them. I can't provide female supervision, but I can provide love, stability, and a home where they're valued for who they are, not what they can do. He paused, his voice growing stronger. I know what it's like to be unwanted. I know what it's like to lose everything that matters. These girls saved me from becoming someone I didn't want to be. If that's not proper, then maybe propriety isn't what children need most. Judge Morrison was quiet for a long moment, studying the faces of the 3 girls who stood protectively close to the man they called father. Finally, he spoke. In 20 years on this bench, I've seen many custody cases. I've seen children fought over like property, and I've seen children abandoned by people who should have loved them. He looked directly at Jonas. What I see here is rarer. 3 children who found a father who's found his purpose in raising them. The courtroom held its collective breath. However, the judge continued, and Jonas felt his heart stop. The concerns about propriety aren't entirely without merit. A bachelor raising 3 young girls will face ongoing scrutiny and social challenges. Emma grabbed Jonas's hand, her small fingers gripping tightly. Therefore, Judge Morrison said, I'm ordering a 6-month probationary period during which time Mr. McCready will receive regular visits from a county representative to ensure the children's continued well-being. If, at the end of that period, all parties are thriving, I'll grant full legal adoption. The courtroom erupted in mixed reactions, but Jonas only heard Emma's squeal of joy and felt Lucy's fierce hug. Sarah simply smiled and whispered, She says the hard part is over now. She says we really are a family forever. 6 months later, Jonas stood in the same courtroom, but this time the atmosphere was entirely different. The county representative, Mrs. Collins, had filed glowing reports about the McCready household. The girls had thrived academically, socially, and emotionally. More importantly, Jonas had become a respected member of the community, the grieving widower who'd found his way back to life through the love of 3 remarkable children. Mr. McCready, Judge Morrison said with something that might have been a smile, it's the judgment of this court that Lucy, Emma, and Sarah McCready are exactly where they belong. Adoption is granted, with all the rights and responsibilities therein. As they walked out of the courthouse as a legally recognized family, Emma skipped ahead, Lucy walked proudly beside Jonas, and Sarah paused to wave goodbye to someone only she could see. Are they leaving now? Jonas asked quietly. Sarah nodded. They say their job is done. We don't need guardian angels anymore because we have each other. That evening, as Jonas tucked his daughters into the beds he'd built for them in their expanded cabin, he marveled at the journey that had brought them together. He'd thought he was buying 3 orphans for $9. Instead, he'd been given 3 daughters by the spirit of the child he'd lost, a love so strong it had reached across death itself to ensure he wasn't alone. Papa Jonas, Emma said sleepily, do you ever miss being by yourself? Jonas smiled, looking around at the chaos of family life. Toys scattered on the floor, books stacked on every surface, 3 pairs of shoes by the door. Emma, I can't even remember what alone felt like, and I never want to find out again. As he blew out the lamp and listened to his daughter's peaceful breathing, Jonas whispered a final thank you to the wife and child who had somehow orchestrated this miracle. He'd learned that love didn't end with death. It just transformed, finding new ways to bloom in unexpected places. Outside, 3 roses grew in the garden he'd replanted with his daughter's help. Inside, 3 children slept safely in the home they'd helped him rebuild. And somewhere between the visible and invisible worlds, 2 spirits rested easy, knowing their work was complete. Jonas Macready had found his family in the most impossible way. But as he'd learned, the best families were often the ones that seemed impossible until love made them inevitable. Sometimes the most wanted children were the ones nobody else wanted. Sometimes the best fathers were the ones who thought they'd never be fathers at all. And sometimes $9 could buy you everything that mattered in the world. If you were wise enough to recognize that what mattered most couldn't be measured in money, it could only be measured in love. And love, once given freely, always found a way to multiply beyond anything you could have imagined. And so, in the Montana mountains of 1887, a broken woodsman learned that sometimes the most precious families are forged in the fires of shared grief and mutual healing. Jonas Macready discovered that love doesn't die. It just finds new ways to express itself, sometimes through the innocent voice of a 4-year-old who speaks to angels. Lucy, Emma, and Sarah Macready proved that orphans aren't children without families. They're children waiting for the right family to find them. Their courage in the courtroom showed that love chosen is often stronger than love inherited, and that the bonds formed by choice can be unbreakable. Together, they demonstrated that healing happens when broken people refuse to stay broken, that gardens can bloom again after years of neglect, that homes can fill with laughter after being silent with grief, and that sometimes the most impossible love stories begin with endings and find their happy conclusions in new beginnings that feel too miraculous to believe. Jonas learned that being a father isn't about biology, it's about showing up every day with love, patience, and the willingness to put someone else's needs before your own. His daughters taught him that children don't need perfect parents. They need present parents who are committed to growing alongside them. But this story raises so many questions that keep us wondering long after the final rose bloomed in their restored garden. What happened to the Macready family as the girls grew up? Did Lucy become the teacher she dreamed of being? Did Emma's insatiable curiosity lead her to become an explorer or scientist? And what about Sarah? Did her supernatural gift continue as she matured, or did it fade as she no longer needed to bridge the gap between worlds? More intriguingly, what other miracles were happening in 1887 Montana territory? We know Jonas wasn't the only broken man seeking redemption in the wilderness. The frontier was full of people running from their pasts, looking for second chances, carrying secrets that could change everything if the right person discovered them. What if there were other children at that orphan auction? Children with their own mysterious connections to the spirit world. What if Sarah wasn't the only child who could speak to the dead? Imagine the stories we could tell about a young boy who communicates with the ghost of a Civil War soldier, or a girl who receives guidance from a grandmother who died before she was born. And what about the townspeople of Cedar Falls? Mrs. Collins, the county representative who monitored the Macready family, what secrets might she have been hiding? What about Judge Morrison, who Sarah said had lost children of his own? His story of loss and how it shaped his understanding of what family really means could be a powerful tale of redemption and justice. The spiritual elements of this story also open up fascinating possibilities. If love really can transcend death, if spirits can guide the living toward healing and happiness, then what other impossible reunions might be orchestrated by those who've passed on? What other families might be formed by supernatural intervention disguised as coincidence? Think about it. What if there was a sequel following the Macready girls as they grew up and started having supernatural experiences of their own? What if Lucy, now a teacher, encounters a student who reminds her of her younger self? What if Emma, exploring the mountains, discovers ancient Native American burial grounds where spirits still walk? What if Sarah, as a teenager, must use her gift to help another broken family find healing? Or we could explore the broader community around Cedar Falls. What stories of love, loss, and redemption were playing out in the neighboring ranches and settlements? What other broken people were being healed by unexpected encounters with exactly the family they needed? The themes of chosen family versus blood family resonate just as powerfully today as they did in 1887. In our modern world, how many people are still searching for the place where they belong? How many are waiting for someone to choose them, not for what they can provide, but for who they are? This story also makes us think about the role of faith and spirituality in healing trauma. Whether you believe Sarah truly spoke to spirits or simply possessed extraordinary intuition, her ability to help Jonas connect with his lost love was the key to his transformation. What other forms might spiritual healing take? What other ways might the universe conspire to bring healing to those who need it most? Have you ever experienced a moment when what seemed like coincidence turned out to be destiny? Have you witnessed love that transcended loss, or seen families form in ways that defied conventional wisdom? More importantly, have you ever felt the presence of someone you'd lost, guiding you toward happiness they wanted you to have? And here's what we really want to know. If we were to continue the McCready family story, what would you want to see happen next? Should we follow the girls as they grow up and face the challenges of young womanhood in the American West? Should we explore Jonas's past and the tragic story of how he lost Margaret and Rose? Or should we expand the universe and tell stories about other families in Cedar Falls who found healing in unexpected ways? Maybe you'd like to see a story about how Jonas and his daughters handled the girls' first romances. Imagine the protective father who'd gained his daughters so miraculously, now having to let them go to build families of their own. Or perhaps you'd enjoy a tale about Sarah as a young woman, using her supernatural gift to help other families connect with their lost loved ones. What about the practical challenges they must have faced? How did three girls from the orphanage adapt to life in the wilderness? What did they do during the harsh Montana winters when they were snowed in for months? How did Jonas handle the inevitable questions about teenage feelings, growing up, and the complexities of raising daughters without a mother figure? The spiritual aspect also opens up questions about the nature of the afterlife in the Wild West Stories universe. If Margaret and Rose could guide events from beyond the grave, what about other spirits? Are there malevolent ghosts as well as benevolent ones? What about the Native American spiritual traditions that would have been prevalent in Montana territory? How might those intersect with Sarah's gift? We're also curious about the historical context. What real events were shaping Montana territory in the 1880s and 1890s that might have affected the McCready family? How did they navigate the Indian Wars, the expansion of the railroad, the mining booms and busts? These historical events could provide rich backdrops for future stories about Jonas and his daughters. Tell us in the comments, what aspect of the McCready family story intrigues you most? Do you want to see more supernatural elements, more family drama, more historical adventure, or more romance as the girls grow up? Are you more interested in prequels that explore Jonas and Margaret's original love story, or sequels that follow the family into the future? What other characters from this story deserve their own tales? What about Reverend Patterson, who had to make the heartbreaking decision to auction off children like livestock? What drove him to that point, and how did witnessing Jonas's transformation affect his own faith? What about the other people who bid on the girls? What were their stories, and how might their lives have been different if they'd been the ones to take the children home? Here's something else to consider. This story took place during a time when adoption was rare and informal. What legal and social challenges would the McCready family have continued to face as the girls grew up? How would their unconventional family structure have been viewed by neighbors, potential suitors, and society at large? And what about the broader theme of men learning to be nurturing fathers? Jonas's transformation from grieving widower to devoted father was remarkable, but it couldn't have been easy. What other stories could we tell about frontier men who found themselves responsible for children and had to learn how to provide not just physical care, but emotional support and guidance? The story also touches on themes of economic hardship and social inequality. What other tales could we explore about the intersection of poverty, family, and love in the American West? How did other families survive when formal social services didn't exist, and community support was often the difference between life and death? Don't forget to subscribe to Wild West Stories for more incredible tales of love that conquers impossible odds, families that form against all expectations, and the courage to believe in second chances when everyone else has given up hope. Hit that notification bell because we're planning something special based on your feedback. But most importantly, share your ideas in the comments below. What stories do you want us to tell next? What characters deserve deeper exploration? What themes resonate most powerfully with your own experience of family, loss, and healing? Your suggestions literally shape the stories we choose to tell. Whether you want more supernatural elements, more historical detail, more family drama, or more romance, your voice matters in determining what tales we explore next in the Wild West Stories universe. Until next time, remember, every heart that chooses love over fear makes the world a little more magical. Every person who opens their home to someone who needs belonging helps prove that miracles are just love, finding creative ways to happen. Sometimes $3 really can buy you everything that matters. Sometimes $9 can purchase a lifetime of purpose. And sometimes the family you're meant to have finds you exactly when you've stopped believing that families like that still exist. Jonas McCready thought he was saving 3 orphan children. Instead, 3 angels disguised as little girls saved a man who'd forgotten how to live. What impossible family story is waiting to be told next? Help us decide, and let's discover together just how many miracles love can create when it refuses to accept that some things are impossible. Thanks for joining us in the Montana mountains, where love conquered death and families bloomed like roses after the hardest winter. Now tell us, what miracles are you ready to believe in?